Welcome to another episode with your host, Robert E. Hansen, psychic medium, author, and public speaker.
Welcome to this podcast. The name of this podcast is Ivan Pavlov and His Dogs. If you're not familiar with the name Ivan Pavlov, many people are not. He was a Russian therapist. He was a Russian scientist who did a great deal of work in the field of conditioned behavior. Probably the most famous experiment, which most of you probably are aware of. You may not realize the guy that came up with it was Pavlov, but the name of the experiment, or the type of experiment, I should say, is very, very common. When an animal, especially a dog, because Pavlov used dogs to help him and assist him in his scientific studies, when an animal has food presented near it, close to it, the animal will often start to drool. Saliva will form at the edges of the animal's mouth, and you'll see a dog or a pet of yours, if you're starting to prepare food or perhaps make their dinner, they will start to become a little bit excited, a little agitated, a little hopeful, a little bit animated, and you may see some drooling form at the edge of their mouth. You may see some saliva dripping from their tongue, perhaps even onto your floor or your backyard rug, wherever you may be feeding these beautiful animals. And Pavlov noticed this. It is called a conditioned reaction. Food would be placed in front of a dog and a bell would be rung. He would have like a little school bell and he would ring it. And every time his dog received food, he would ring the bell. And he did this for a while. He conditioned his animals, he conditioned his dogs to know that when he rang a bell, that food was coming. And what he found is that even after he rang the bell and no food was available, let's say he just rang the bell during the middle of the day, the animals suddenly would turn because they heard the sound of the bell, and they would anticipate food, and even if there was no food available, the drooling would start. So he began to sense one thing after the other, and he realized that behavior could be conditioned. It wasn't just some kind of random act that individual animals happened to do. He really began to study this, and it became so powerful a study that even the Russian government had asked him if he could possibly come up with conditioning techniques to affect prison inmates to basically alter their behavior over time through certain patterns of inducted behavior, causing the inmates knowing or giving the inmates insight, so to speak, as to when they'll be fed, what not to do, what they should do, what they can't do, and the conditioning ideas really took root. One of the big projects that he also did was the use of discomfort and the use of fatigue. He would take dogs and he would place them on a treadmill and he would force these animals to run, not with cruelty. There was not a cruelty thing. I know some of you may think how cruel he was. He was actually a gentle man, but he was trying to help himself and society learn certain behaviors. And he found that when he made the dogs run on a treadmill for any length of time, the dogs would then become very, very tired. And when the dogs were exhausted, he then tried to train them and condition them. And he found that even the more resistant dogs to conditioning, the ones that kind of fought back against him, the ones that really were kind of a tougher breed type of a dog, kind of like an inmate that would really be out of control, he found that by keeping the animals tired, by giving them tasks, giving them chores, that their resistance to their environment diminished. And they would simply supplicate, or they would give in to what was going on, because frankly, they were just too tired to fight against it. So Pavlov introduced an idea that conditioning could have an element of fatigue. And that when one was made to be fatigued, when one was worked hard, their ability to resist diminished. And of course, this became one of the backdrop ideas which went out of control to the work camps. The idea of the Gulag and in the Holocaust and other places where they took work to a maximum, where they exhausted the inmates, exhausted the prisoners, where basically they took on almost a zombie-like state. That was never the intention of the experiment, but others, not Pavlov, others ran it too far. He also did another experiment dealing with electricity. Not deep currents, not torture currents, nothing to injure the animals, but he also placed small electrodes on the paws or on the skin of some of his experimental dogs. And he found by giving them very light doses of electric shock, uncomfortable as it was, the animals also responded extremely well. Some of you may have seen experiments with rats in a cage, where rats were given a certain piece of food, and in some cases they were given an addictive narcotic to eat on for a few days, maybe a few weeks. And when the rat in the cage was craving for heroin, or when the rat in the cage was craving for cocaine, they would set it up so this little rodent could have access to the cocaine, but in order to get to it, it had to step on an electric plate, which was really unpleasant. Now, some rats attempted to get the cocaine, even though they were craving it. It was addicting in their system. They touched the electric plate and they backed away. No matter how hard they tried, they backed away. No matter how hard they figured out how to get the cocaine, the pain of the electric plate was just too much, and they withdrew, and eventually the addiction left them because the pain of getting it was too great than the addiction of keeping the need for it. Very interesting. And then there were some rats, other rodents, mice, I take it, hamsters possibly in the experiment, I'm not sure, but I know rats were definitely used, lab rats. And some of these rats actually had the drive, the instinct, not just the instinct, but the willingness to endure the pain just to get to the heroin. And when they saw this, two things occurred. They said, A, there are certain animals that indifferent to the pain, or if they did have feelings for the pain, they drove through it, they pushed through it. Their ability to handle the pain was there apparently, and they were able to continue to use their drugs that they were administered, and they craved them desperately, and they were willing to suffer to get to something that made them feel better. So they also began to realize for certain people, you create up a situation of uncomfortability like the electric shock, many will withdraw and leave the addiction, the drug, alone, because the process of getting it is too unpleasant. And yet for others, and apparently there were many, they would absolutely fight through the discomfort to get to the drug. And it almost didn't matter. Eventually, they raised the amperage on the electric shocks to the point which it was excruciating, and none of the animals really did it. Apparently, some of them actually died trying. Now, I want to go back to the dogs for a minute, because this is what's really driving this podcast. Pavlov found that when he was putting his dogs through some of these uncomfortable skills, when he was testing these dogs, trying out these dogs, experimenting with these dogs, he found when the electric shocks and the treadmill, that most of the dogs could endure the treadmill, they could endure the exhaustion for maybe 15 to 20 minutes. And this seemed to occur, now listen carefully to this seemed to occur on Mondays, on Tuesdays, on Wednesdays, Fridays. It did not happen on Thursdays. Saturdays and Sundays, he did not experiment. So every day, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday, his dogs lasted 15 minutes, 12 minutes, 10 minutes, a very short amount of time. But on Thursdays, for some crazy reason, at least it seemed crazy in the beginning, these dogs would last a half an hour, 45 minutes. Triple, sometimes double, triple the enduring time than Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday. And so Pavlov was completely flipping out. He didn't know what was the source of this altered behavior. What the hell was happening that all these other days these dogs are reacting in 20 minutes, and on a Thursday these dogs are going for an hour? He could not understand it. And then one day, weeks into these experiments, he realized that the apprentice, his lab assistant, was different on Thursdays. Different. He had one lab assistant that seemed to, I guess, was working on Mondays, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and one day during the midweek, he had this different lab assistant there on a Thursday. It seemed every Thursday this other guy was there, not the normal guy. So Pavlov watched this guy on Thursdays. He watched this assistant to say, what the hell is this guy doing to my dogs before testing begins? I don't understand it. What's he doing? And as it turned out, the assistant had tremendous compassion for these dogs. And he would hold them, and he would rub them, and he would talk to them before they had to go on and have this experiment done. And he would tell them, I love you. I'm careful for you. It's going to be over before you know it. Don't worry about it. I'll be right here. And when you're done, I will make sure you're warm. I'll make sure you have milk. I'll make sure you have a treat. Just get through this and I'll take care of you. And Pavlov found that this behavior altered everything. And he saw, which is so beautiful, he saw that love and compassion, that gentleness and kindness, when there was someone who cared for these animals and expressed it to them, they received that into their being. They actually sensed it in their soul, and they were very willing to endure much more struggle, much more challenge, much more discomfort than on any other day and for any other lab assistant except this one guy who demonstrated the power of love and compassion. So Pavlov not only learned that through conditioning of electric shock and ringing of bells and treadmills and so many other different types of experiments, that he had helped direct human behavior. But all of it did not touch the power of love and compassion, which not only altered the reactions to negative behavior, but also created a more kind, more compassionate, more gentle dog at the end of it. So Pavlov began to realize that when punishment is given and when discipline is provided, if driving behind it is only cruelty, indifference, mechanical behavior, the result is negative, it increases, it cultivates more and more irritation, and the reasons for riots in prisons, the reasons for all of this disruption was due to the fact of cruel behavior. And he also went on to say that if you would just add a little compassion, a little knowledge, a little love, a little explanation, that even though the inmates were enduring very tough situations, at least they had some sense that people around them had some caring for them, and that their behavior, although unpleasant, could be given to them from a different dose of human contact. And through that, he learned that healing will come as a result of love, compassion, directed behavior, and conditioning all working together to create the result of a positive inmate or a more balanced human. Now, did it work for everyone? Of course not. Were there inmates that this absolutely was just meaningless to, that did not respond? For sure. There are certain people who were like those other rats, just would be willing to die than give up the heroin. There are people that are almost willing to die to keep their negative behavior going. They are so driven by it genetically, from society, from their own combination of events, they are untouchable. But the high majority of the inmates had their behaviors changed. They returned back into society with a much different approach to life. They found that when they were given some love and compassion, not only by the jail systems, the prison systems, that there was some saying, okay, you made a mistake. This is your punishment. We are here to direct you. We are here to get you back on track. Our intention is not to break you. Our intention is to alter you and help you see a different way of living. And it became a very, very, very famous process in the prison systems. It sadly has fallen away from our days. Today they have gone back to mass housing and things like that, where the inmates just, do what they do and the guards just go do what they do. But back then, the idea of this was very, very powerful. It has moved along even into society today, such as groups of AA, NA, other 12-step programs, in other counseling sessions, and other recovery programs, in working with people who are still challenged on behavioral bases, and the idea that to add compassion and love to any of the conditions created to redo conditioning, to rebuild anyone, is absolutely essential, and the outcome will not only be powerful, it will be awesome, and it can change everything. Thus the simple quote, love can work miracles, love can change anything. Love is the most powerful element in the human experience. And with love, there is compassion, there is kindness, there is grace. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.